Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to join the Shadow Home Secretary in moving the reasoned amendment in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. I'd like to start by sending my condolences to the friends and family of the asylum seeker who tragically died whilst on the Bibi Stockholm this morning. I'd also like to thank all those across the House who've sent their condolences to my family and I over the past 10 days. We've been overwhelmed by the flood of tributes and messages which have made us prouder than ever of what my mum was and all that she achieved. So it would be very tempting for me to respond by taking a more conciliatory approach to this debate today. But given the state of the legislation that's before us, and given everything that my mother stood for, I think she'd be absolutely appalled that such a thought might ever cross my mind. So let's get stuck in, shall we? I'd firstly like to start by thanking the House for an excellent debate, with gratitude in particular to my honourable friends on these benches who spoke with such passion and logic and conviction throughout the course of this debate. And of course I'd like to welcome the latest Immigration Minister to his post. I note that the performance of his predecessor led the Prime Minister to conclude that the job was too big for one Conservative member alone, so they've cut the position in two. Well, the more the merrier, I say. Welcome one and all. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I began in this post 2 years ago, my first opposite number was fronting the Nationality and Borders Bill, which effectively handed each asylum seeker who crossed the Channel a badge saying, "I am inadmissible for asylum," whilst making no provision for what practically could be done with those unprocessed claimants. And so they duly ended up in taxpayer-funded emergency hotels at a cost of £8 million a day. Next up was my second opposite number, with the Illegal Migration Bill. It was rushed through Parliament, yet not a single one of its core measures on detention and removal have been enacted. The Act is on the shelf, gathering dust. And now we have my third opposite number, who's well and truly taken one for the team by agreeing to introduce this utterly absurd piece of legislation, a bill which his predecessor described as a further betrayal of Tory voters. So the deck chairs have been rearranged, but the Titanic is still steaming towards the iceberg. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Rwanda scheme is its origin story. Cast your mind back to April 2022, Madam Deputy Speaker. Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, but he was in the eye of the Partygate storm. So he cooked up a cunning plan to rescue his premiership, which I believe became known as Operation Save Big Dog. And lo, the Rwanda scheme was born. Now, like every other scheme that Mr. Johnson's ever been associated with, it was extortionately expensive and doomed to fail. Yet here we are, 18 months, 2 Prime Ministers, 2 Home Secretaries and 3 Immigration Ministers later, and the benches opposite are still shackled to a policy that was only ever to be designed to be a diversion from a scandal. Now, true to form, the Rwanda scheme is still being deployed as a skin-saving operation, the only difference being that it's the current Prime Minister who is desperately trying to cling to power by burnishing his Faragist credentials to keep the circling vultures at bay. It really is déjà vu all over again. I turn now to the substance of this new Please, Please, Please Make Rwanda Safe bill, which is without doubt the most absurd piece of legislation I've ever seen, because it does nothing at all to make Rwanda safe. It just asserts that Rwanda is safe and that our courts are not allowed to say otherwise. It argues that black is white and white is black, that the grass is blue and the sky is green. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the spirit of this legislation, I'm thinking I might try to introduce a bill which deems that Wales actually won the Rugby World Cup recently. Further still, the Rwandan government is calling the shots. Having extracted 300 million, or today we think we heard 400 million, from the British government, Mr. Kagame is now instructing the Prime Minister not to do anything that might break international law. It really is quite extraordinary. How ironic that some on the benches opposite rail against our international legal obligations And yet they seemed quite content to allow Kigali to dictate the terms of our asylum policies. So much for taking back control. And the upshot of this fiasco is that the Prime Minister has gone for a fudge. The Supreme Court judgment was his opportunity to stop flogging the dead horse that the Rwanda scheme has clearly become, but he has chosen not to take it. And he is not also prepared to go with the full-fat option that some on the benches opposite are urging him to adopt. So inevitably, his semi-skimmed formula satisfies nobody because, as everybody, from this side of the House to even the former Home Secretary have said, it is destined to fail, both legally and in operational terms. The fundamental contradictions at the heart of this bill are also quite astonishing. First, the Home Secretary told us from that dispatch box last week that the bill complies with international law. But the very first page of the bill confirms that he's actually not sure that it does. Second, the bill says that Rwanda is safe for refugees, but then also states that the government might need to offer refuge to asylum seekers from, checks notes, Rwanda. Third, it's meant to be about stopping what the government calls illegal migrants from seeking sanctuary in the UK. But if one of these asylum seekers commits a crime in Rwanda, then that person can be sent back to, checks notes again, the UK. Never mind Operation Save Big Dog, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is Operation Dog's Breakfast. But the Rwanda scheme is not only unlawful, it is also unaffordable and unworkable. Firstly, let's give credit where credit is due. The Rwandan government has played a blinder on this one, and they're laughing all the way to the bank. They really did see this Prime Minister coming. I mean, £400 million for absolutely nothing in return, no questions asked, really is a sweet deal. Although never let it be said that the party opposite has failed to get any flights off to Rwanda, because they absolutely have. They have proudly flown not one, not two, but 3 Home Secretaries to Kigali. So I guess you could say that so far it's £130 million per Home Secretary, which I'm sure the British people will see as an excellent use of their taxpayers' money. I will.
I think the honourable member, he will know that I work for his father and my daughter worked for his mother. Does he think that this whole facade is about a form of international development? They don't like international development. This is a way of actually targeting one country and giving 140, 200 million pounds.
Well, I thank my honourable friend and thank you for his kind words as well. He's absolutely right that the vast majority of people fleeing war and persecution end up in neighbouring countries in the region in which their plight is generated. And of course we need to have an overseas development programme that is focused and is seeking through enlightened self-interest to ensure that we support those countries. Now, we're constantly told by the benches opposite that the Rwanda scheme will act as a deterrent, but that claim simply does not stand up to scrutiny, because Rwanda can take less than 1% of the asylum seekers who cross the channel in small boats. And when you're dealing with people who have already risked life and limb to get as far as northern France, it is inconceivable that they will be deterred by a 1% risk of anything. The Labour Party has therefore been steadfast in our opposition to this madness. From the very outset, we on these benches are absolutely committed to stopping the Tory boat's chaos, but we will never vote for a madcap gimmick that is unaffordable, unworkable and unlawful. We have constantly said that the government needs to redirect the money that's being squandered on this nonsense into a cross-border police unit, a new returns unit and a security partnership with Europol that can stop the Tory boat's chaos at source. And we have consistently called for the government to speed up decision-making and remove the 30% of asylum seekers who fail to get leave to remain, swiftly and safely. A small upfront investment in Labour's plan would save the taxpayer an enormous £2 billion. Our reasoned amendment sets out why this bill is a sham and what the government should be doing instead, and I urge all members across all benches to get behind it. And I trust that, in his concluding remarks, the Minister will confirm whether or not the government will be accepting any significant amendments at committee stage for this bill, because the House really deserves that clarity, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Conservative Party is no longer a serious party at all. It's a rabble, an alphabet soup of factions and cabals. The former Home Secretary is constantly on manoeuvres, and the former Immigration Minister is firing broadsides on a daily basis. And we have a Prime Minister who is so desperate to save his own skin that he apparently invited an outfit called the New Conservatives to Number 10 for breakfast this morning. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the reality is that the Prime Minister wasn't actually at the table at all. He was on the menu, consumed by the warring factions in his party, devoured by his own weakness and lack of judgment. Madam Deputy Speaker, our country simply cannot afford more of this chaos. We're in the midst of a cost of living crisis, and our public services are crumbling. But we have a Conservative Party that is at war with itself and completely incapable of governing. But the good news is that the Prime Minister does have a way out of this mess, Madam Deputy Speaker. He can call a general election so that voters across this country can kick him and his shambolic administration out of office and finally give our country the leadership that it needs and deserves. Thank you.
Before I call the Minister, can I just say once again how important it is for those who